Yeah, and Stephen, we were just saying how lucky it is that it's spring in Cape Town now, and you all have to deal with the really cold weather on that side of the world.
Yeah. I've heard it's cold outside. We're in the middle of lockdown, but haven't been out there.
And the Netherlands is really not a cold half of the year kind of place to be. And I lived in Rotterdam for a year, and they're good with wind and rain, but there won't be any snow, so that's good.
Yeah, it doesn't get. Do you have snow in? You said you're in Warsaw, hey?
Yeah. Here there should be some. Last year there wasn't really any, but this year I'm hoping there will be. Which it's really nice on the day, and then the next day it sucks. So
yeah.
So we'll see.
Hectic, but cool. So Rachel, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast this morning. It is such a pleasure to have you both.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So before we get started, I have a list of rapid fire questions that you couldn't prepare for. And it's just to get a bit of an idea into who you are and the kind of person and life you lead. Don't think too hard. I'll just sort of lead them on, and whatever comes to mind, just answer as fast as you can, I guess. But so Rachel, we'll start with you. After a really tiring day, how do you spend your evening?
Glass of white wine and some trashy reality TV, unfortunately.
And Stephen?
Yeah, I wish it was that, but it's putting my 4-year-old and 2-year-old to bed, and then after that, joining and finishing, help make dinner, and then, I don't know, then it's just collapse on the couch on the nearest horizontal surface, I suppose.
And then Rachel, what's a really good work-related book that you've read recently?
Actually, there's one book that I'm reading at the moment with my team. We have kind of a book club that we're doing. A book called An Elegant Puzzle. It's all about kind of managing engineering teams. And so, yeah, so far it's interesting. Written by an engineer, so it's very structured and very easy to work through.
Cool. And Stephen, what about you?
Yeah, because of the kids thing, the reading is taking a back seat. But that said, a recent book which I've read, not very work-related, unless you're thinking very macroeconomic, book called Homo Deus, which is the second book after Sapiens. It's a bit of a history book, but it's also a bit of a look into the future. So because we work in what we work in, it's a pretty interesting book to make your macro bets from. So I think it's semi-work related.
Very, very cool. And then Stephen, starting with you this time, what's something that you're glad you said no to recently, and why?
Wow. Something I said no to. I suppose we're in the middle of a heavy lockdown in Amsterdam at the moment. So going into the office in the last 2 weeks. As things are getting more hectic, I've been working from home, I suppose very topically. But yeah, I think it's about being responsible, even though I'd love to get away from the kids and get into the office. But again, we'll unpack that.
Yeah,
I think it was the right decision to do.
Super. And Rachel, what about you? What's something you're glad you said no to, and why?
Probably more of a work-related thing. So as usual, it's sort of when's the right time to do something. And I don't know about you guys, but in my personality, I probably love being a little bit too much involved in too many different things. And so I feel like every day I'm saying no to stuff, which sounds great. But yeah, definitely the right thing to kind of pass on. So it's always, hey, do you have an opinion on this? Would you like to be involved in this? That kind of thing.
Cool. And last question. What is something that's cost you less than €50, but has been the best investment most recently?
So I bought this sunrise alarm clock recently, which is it. I think it's more of an emotional feeling about it working than whether it's actually working. But I feel like I'm doing something good for myself. So I don't know if you guys know about it. Unfortunately, I don't have the 2-year-old and the 4-year-old, who I am sure are very good sunrise alarm clocks. But this mechanical version, wakes you up using light initially. And then I think I've got some lovely sort of jungle themed noises that I wake up to. So that's been working pretty well.
Oh, that sounds so interesting, Stephen. What I assume your kids are your sunrise alarm. So
Yeah.
what's been a good
Generally, I
investment for
spend
you?
my money on noise cancelling earphones.
Actually, totally opposite here.
But no, recently I bought a cell phone mount for my bicycle. Yeah, so we have an
Ooh.
electric bike, as one does when living in the Netherlands. And I'm very new here, so I get lost a lot. So that has made a huge difference to be able to just mount the phone on the bike and be able to get directions, because you get a fine if you're just holding your phone while cycling, which I learned the hard way.
Wow.
Ooh, ouch. Cool. We'll leave it at that. Great. Thanks for the intros. That was really, really interesting. Nice little warm up. So before we dive into the conversation for today, I thought just to give a little context into the both of you and also each of your companies. So Rachel, if you could just kick us off, could you give a little bit of insight into the problem that Codility solves, and maybe like a little bit of an elevator pitch?
Yeah, sure. In terms of the sort of problem that we focus on, the problem that we solve is really around helping engineering leaders figure out which are the right candidates for them to hire to join their team. So we're kind of squarely focused on helping the hiring manager make that decision, which is a pretty important decision these days. It has always been, but I think now is, more important than ever. So the quality of the people you bring onto your team, the type of engineering team that you're able to kind of build around you, in a lot of ways decides whether or not your company or your initiative or your project is going to be successful. Right. And so that's why we really kind of focus on that initial qualification phase.
Cool. And what is what part do you play in that mission? What are some of your day-to-day responsibilities in that?
So personally, I'm responsible for marketing. I apologize, I didn't have a perfect elevator pitch there for you, but I'm not a salesperson. So ask me to prepare a script for you, and I can do that. But so I'm responsible for marketing. So a big part of my role is really talking through the sort of problems that we focus on and how our customers and companies around the world are tackling that. And I could do some name dropping if that makes sense. So, working with these big companies, right, with really big, meaningful engineering teams like Microsoft,
right.
Unity, Tesla, how are they approaching hiring people, how are they approaching upskilling people within their organizations. That's really my job, is kind of telling their story to the rest of the world.
Right. So I assume because of that, you probably interface quite closely with engineers and anyone in tech. So even though it is a marketing role, your interface is quite close and you're quite engaged.
Yeah, and we're a product-led company, and I have a background in product marketing, so I work very closely with our product and our engineering team, which is a third of the company at least, I would say. Working pretty closely with that, and then obviously the tech leads and the engineering leaders who come from our customer side.
Awesome, cool. And then Stephen, I don't think I've ever actually had an introduction from OfferZen on this thing, so this is very exciting for me. Tell me about this company that I've never heard of.
All right. So for all the listeners that are finally figuring out what OfferZen is, so the problem that we solve is really just finding great talent. So Rach's company, they're going to be helping you figure out, once you found the talent, whether this talent is competent and what they say they are and can do the things they say they can do. We're really trying to solve the problem that finding really great talent for your team, talent that fits with your team and can take you to the next level, that kind of concept of the 10x engineer. We believe fundamentally that software developers are multiplicative on a company's value. You add a couple of insanely good software developers and you can create world-changing software, impactful software. So finding those people is very difficult. So traditional methods, job boards, kind of recruiters, those methods are necessary, but you kind of always end up with the same people. So we take a bit of a different approach. We have always been community first. So we are founded by 2 developers and have just a team of makers. And because of that, we build communities. Those communities we engage with for many, many years. And through that, we build trust within those communities. Very, very gratefully for us, the people within those communities end up using us to find a job, which is great for the companies that work with us because they get to hire from those communities. And so far, that works. So we've been doing that for 5 years. In South Africa, we have a massive community. We have over 100,000 people that have entered the community, engaging with us consistently, doing crazy things from helping a bank develop a banking API through to creating big surveys. And we distribute a lot of T-shirts and stickers and those kinds of things, just to kind of keep it going. So that's what we do. We've recently launched in Amsterdam and the Netherlands, and we're starting to build a community here, meeting a whole bunch of amazing people, and starting to work with some really cool companies here locally as well. So
awesome. And just a little bit of insight into your part in that mission.
Yeah, cool. So my title is the VP of Growth, but I do a very similar job to Reg. I think so that includes marketing and a whole bunch of stuff like that. One of the things that I did mention a couple of times is the community. There's a big community building aspect to that. So that's smaller, more intimate events, Slack groups, that kind of thing. And that also kind of falls within our world. The idea is just building up things that create value for a community in a scalable way, doing that at a very high frequency and with super competent people like you, Joe, adding value to the world and hoping that we get some value back at some point.
Epic. So I think that is a really cool, we've already touched on some of the stuff we're going to dive into today, but just to sort of define the problem area here. So what I think is really interesting, both of your companies put together these reports looking at the state of remote work for developers and engineers, and really looking at how COVID-19, but also further than that, this like shift to remote work, how that's impacted the software industry. And Stephen, I guess our report here was over like 1,500 developers from South Africa. Rach with Codility, you surveyed, I think it was like over 800 engineers, and your community is a little bit more spread out from EU states, that sort of community. So we're going to dive into some of the specifics of those reports, but I want to do first a little bit of a pulse check and then double click on some of that in the next bit. So just to do the little bit of a lay of the land thing, could you, like Rach, just start by, based on the report and your insights in particular, like what's the general situation that you're seeing for remote work at the moment? Like where are companies and developers at?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the way we see it is that the remote kind of world that we're in today is obviously not one that we chose to be in. And so COVID forced everyone to move remotely. And I think, that happened for a lot of people almost overnight. The truth is, though, that I think, remote work for engineering teams, distributed teams, it's nothing new in our kind of industry, right? So I think devs for a long time have been moving more and more towards remote work. And there's definitely been a lot of interest in that over the years. We did a similar report last year looking at developers at work and how can companies engage their engineering teams more. And in that report last year, we found out that 61% of developers who were already working remotely wanted to continue working remotely, and another 46% of developers who were working in offices at the time wanted to move remote at some point in the future. And so, that kind of desire and that interest in having a little bit more autonomy and control over how you choose to kind of define your workplace is something that's always been around. And yeah, what we would say is that obviously now with all of us around the world being forced into this space, a lot of companies have really figured out that now's the time to make that change. So if they weren't already open to the idea of remote work, now obviously they have to be. And I think a lot of companies, for the better, have figured out that that's actually something that can work really well. And I know we're going to dig into it more later on, but I think that for a lot of these companies, the option of moving back into the workplace, into a kind of traditional office, is something that just doesn't really make sense for a lot of developers. They want to have that control. They want to be able to define how they kind of structure that. And you see heaps of companies around the world already announcing that they're not going to force people to come back to an office, whether it's Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Salesforce, all of the leaders and the tech kind of community have already kind of made that decision. And I think what we'll start to see more is the traditional ones, the banks, the insurance companies, really starting to figure out their fusion for the future as well. So yeah, this lay of the land is sort of, remote's a trend that's been going already for a long time, and it's been accelerated. Not in a way that any of us would have chosen it to be, but there has been some benefit, I think, that's come out of that for a lot of developers around the world.
Yeah, like you said, I think I'm excited to dive into some of that. And there seems to be this really, I guess, almost unsurprising, but there's still this tension between, developers and engineers driving for remote work, and a lot of tech companies still being quite hesitant. And there's like this push and pull there that we're figuring out how to navigate as we go. But yeah, quickly before we dive into some of that, Stephen, just on your side, like what do you see? What are you seeing the general situation for remote work, and maybe based off of some of your insights, like where are companies and developers at?
Well, I think the way Rachel puts it about how we've been forced into this, I think it doesn't really answer your question. But what I'm super excited about is that this is some global experiment that no one decided to conduct, right? But there are certain companies on the planet, like Codility and OfferZen, that have a vested interest in getting the results and helping the people who are the test specimens understand what those results are so they can make informed decisions. So I think that's quite a unique situation because, as I said, I think tech is the future, and we're clearly seeing that across basically every metric known to humanity. Hence my Homo Deus reference earlier. But I think you can see, the value of the world of our species and economies is moving into tech. The companies that create that are tech companies, and there are certain companies in the world whose job it is to understand how these tech companies are organized. So I feel super privileged that we get to do what we're doing right now and spend time and money and effort and have conversations around what the results of this kind of unsanctioned global experiment are. So the cool thing for me is that I've always held this belief of tech in the future, and as Rachel says, it's just acceleration of trends now. And the exciting thing is to see what happens when trends are accelerated, which companies move fast, and what dynamics that creates, specifically in marketplaces. So once a couple of penguins have dived into the water, what now? And how does that change the face of, for instance, in our space, competing for talent? In a remote world where some companies have given people what they want, how do you compete? The game is just completely changed in the talent fight. Yeah,
cool. I think this is a very nice little introduction, and I'd like to unpack some of the specifics to sort of illustrate why that is the picture that's being painted. And just as an aside, I'll put both of the reports into the show notes. So if anyone's listening and they want to follow along as we go, please do. But just to start, Rachel, with Codility's report, could you give me an idea of what was one of the most surprising insights for you about remote work?
So there were a couple. We can definitely select the top one. For me personally, I think the one that was the most surprising was this difference we found between kind of Gen X engineers versus more millennial or maybe more Gen Z kind of engineers, and how they might be experiencing that shift to remote differently, depending on their experience within their organization, the stage they're at in their career, obviously their home kind of setup, and whether they had space for that. We just saw quite a difference in terms of their happiness around moving remote, and also their fears around it in the future. Yeah. So, a lot of fears popping up, particularly with more experienced developers and millennials around kind of privacy and security. But then also for the more younger, more junior developers, all those questions around, my career progression and how am I learning and all that kind of thing. So,
so what were some of the actual stats from those insights?
Yeah, so what we saw is that for millennials, there was a preference around having a bit more of a kind of 50-50 split when it came to working remotely. So, and I don't know about you guys, I'm a millennial, and I assumed that everyone would have been happier working remotely. And so obviously I've got a particular point of view there, but, the majority of millennials prefer to have a little bit more fluidity there. And, let's not throw out the idea of a physical office into the trash. Let's perhaps evolve that into something new that's a little bit more flexible. Whereas people who, were more experienced were a lot more happy about staying at home more permanently. I think on the privacy and security thing, it was, I think, 66% of millennials who were really worried about privacy and security when using, different systems, different tools that they're now having to use from home. And again, just another kind of factor that I think both developers and the companies they work for are now having to navigate.
Interesting. And then I think you already touched on it a little bit, but why was that such a surprising insight for you?
Well, for me personally, I think it was, as a millennial and as someone of that generation, I was surprised because I've always felt as though having more flexibility was definitely the way to go. That, there's so much that opens up in the world of remote, right? I used to live in the Bay Area for a couple of years, and I very unfortunately had to experience rent prices there. And just the idea that now, if I wanted to work at, one of these big kind of startups down in Silicon Valley, that I wouldn't have to actually pay that rent. I could live in Minnesota, or I could live in Warsaw, or I could live in Auckland. Just even from a kind of diversity angle, there's so much there that I think opens up. So just a lot of barriers from my side was something that I was really excited about. But yeah, as I said, there's pros and cons, I think, and to everything, right? And for a lot of people, that diversity is great, and they've got a lot more opportunity and a lot more chances to apply for places they perhaps wouldn't be considered for previously. But also those fears coming up around security or around, do I have to permanently stay from home, or will there be an office for me in the future if I choose so?
And what kind of impact does that have on tech companies? Because I think like your last point just now was something that I've also been noticing more and more is we're not very good at like defining remote work either right now or also like what is it going to look like in 6 months? Are we going to like try and have an office again in 6 months? What about a year from now? So if with an insight like this, where there seems to be a split between like your millennials, your Gen Zs, your Xs, Gen Xs, what impact does that have on a tech company?
Yeah, it's challenging, right? So you can imagine if you're a leader at one of these companies, there's a lot of decisions that need to be made. So you're balancing obviously safety in the short term, but also, as you said, with kind of the medium term piece on how do I keep my engineers happy? How do I keep them working really well together? How do I expand on their knowledge and help them improve in their individual roles? You got to balance that with what's going to be the future. And I think I almost feel like we probably should have defined remote from each of our perspectives at the start here, because I'm sure, everyone's using the word remote. And as you say, it's totally different. Is that 1 day a week? Is that 0 days a week? Is that I can do what I want when I want? The way that we look at it is, remote being not having a defined requirement to be in an office, for certain days a week. So basically having that flexibility to be able to go where you want. Now, does it expand beyond time zones? That's a whole other question, I think, as well.
Have you already seen, or from the companies you've interacted with, like, have you seen companies that are getting this right, and what kind of stuff are they doing to sort of traverse this challenge?
Yeah, I think we are seeing some companies who are getting it right. A lot of those companies who are ones who are already remote friendly before COVID struck. And so, you can Google a lot of stories about great companies who already have had kind of a remote first kind of policy previously. But those who are transitioning, I think the stuff that they're doing right is, really talking to employees to start with. So, reading reports like Codility's and OfferZen's to understand that it isn't, one shoe fits all type situation, and that depending on not even just generation, but depending on, the personal setup, as I said at the start, if you're paying $4,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bay Area, then, where's your partner going to work from? So people have got really different kind of home setups, or like Stephen here, with his kids, who I'm sure don't respect his meetings as much as perhaps others would. So yeah, I think that's the first thing that companies have to do, and the ones who are getting it right are doing, is talk to your employees to understand how they feel about the situation. I think the second thing is not to so strictly define the future. So I personally think it's okay to work on a 6-month roadmap and to say, look, from now until the end of the year, this is what it's going to be. Plan around it. You're good to go. And then review that again. So we have to be iterative with such big change like this. And it's, as Stephen said earlier, it's such a great opportunity to really define how that should look. And so there's no need to say it's everything or nothing today. It's okay to have a little bit of fluidity there. And then I think the final thing, and it's such a tactical thing, but companies getting it right are really figuring out their tooling. So whether that's communication tooling, security, kind of applications, the way that they're using those, making sure that they're not, burning through everyone's laptops at home whenever they're trying to force an upgrade or something like that. So, being really aware of that and making sure that individuals feel safe working from home and are able to do that effectively.
Epic. Stephen, was there anything you wanted to ask Rachel on, or anything you'd like to add to that point?
Yeah, I think most of the stuff I agree with. So, as you did recall, we've chatted before. We're exploring the space together, and for me, the thing that I keep coming back to is it's just we think we're talking about remote or not remote, but we're not. We're talking about something completely bigger and different. So when I was going through the data, I was like, oh look, high percentage of people prefer remote, and this is great, and this is conclusive. And then I looked at the individual responses of the people who said, I just hate this. Mm-hmm. And if you look at those people, you can't exclude them. For us to build teams, we need to collaborate inclusively with everybody in our company, right? Yeah. So some people prefer remote, some people don't, right? Some people want to come to an office, but some people don't. Now, all of a sudden, coming to the office doesn't make sense because not everyone's there. So now all of a sudden we've added choice and autonomy in workplace and interaction design and completely split the decision making. So we've kind of like decentralized it and then tried to organize, which is it's changed the fundamentals of like how we collaborate as companies. So companies are only useful as a 1 + 1 = 3. So putting a whole bunch of incredibly smart people together, we can create more value than individuals. But if they're not all in the same place, or if they all want different things, then how do you actually do that? So as I was going through, I was looking at it, and what really interested me is the people who were just the opposite of what I would expect, very, very similar to Rachel, and just going, that's me, now that I have kids, but 5 months ago, it would have been the opposite of me. And then I realized that in order for us to get this right, we probably have to move beyond remote or not remote and move to some way in which we can have what I've been kind of thinking around the term like workplace personalization. So we've got that in every other aspect of our life. And I think COVID's just smacked us in the face and forced it down our throats now and said, look, you basically have to personalize like the way each individual interacts with your company, and which is something we're totally not ready for. But I think just acknowledging that and saying, look, everybody's got their own situation. MessageBird did this really well in a recent blog. They were like, look, life happens, work from anywhere. We get it. Let's figure it out together. I think that's like the right way to approach it. Because as we figure this stuff out, we have to be personalized, which means we have to be less organized. And then it becomes, we start to question the nature of like synchronous meetings. And I think the real thing that's going to change is how we collaborate as individuals within companies. And I think big drive towards async communication, towards asynchronous collaboration, the tooling obviously playing a huge part in that. So it was quite existential when I was going through the data, as you can hear. I was like, wow, okay, this is quite big. So it's scary, but it's also exciting at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think that's like a very key point that you both have mentioned now. Like a lot of the angst I see around these kinds of conversations, because people think we either have to go fully remote or all in the office. How am I meant to make that decision? Where, as you said, Rachel, it's like actually talking to the people and, Stephen, your point of learning to collaborate better. And that you can't just exclude the 9% that said they would prefer to work in the office or whatever. Because some people, either they live in digs or they live with their parents, which I think is partly speaks to your millennial point, is like a lot of the time the younger developers still do home shares or they live with their parents, and home offices are really not conducive environments. Or it is like you have kids and you're a parent But the analogy that came to mind now, Stephen, when you were talking is some places in Europe, and I think the UK is driving this. They do these things. Just bear with me with the analogy. They sort of remove traffic lights and road signs from intersections, and they're called shared space zones. So on the offset, a lot of people are really afraid because they're like, but pedestrians are getting knocked over and there's going to be accidents and it's going to be chaos. But by taking away some of that structure, it forces you to be way more aware of what's going on around you and to actually like collaborate and work with the other drivers on the road and be mindful of the pedestrians. And I think that sort of captures this idea is like, yes, this personalization removes some of that structure and like, you know, some of that organization we had before, but I think it's going to force us to be a lot more aware of each individual person in the team, which, you know, in the long run is probably one of the most productive things you could do, and will, you know, has so many knock-on effects. It's like retention and you know, employee engagement and how you communicate and all those things.
Yeah.
But so Stephen, on your side, same question to you. What was one of the most surprising insights from our report about remote work?
From a surprising side, I think it's still down to the split on the people, the real reasons why people don't want it. I'm still kind of infatuated with this idea of people reading this report and going, oh, look, you know, it impacts collaboration positively because, you know, that's higher than the negative. So it's definitely better. So for me, it was looking into that, the pushback. That was the big thing for me. So like 17.5% of people saying that it affects collaboration negatively. You dive into that and you have a look. And what really got me was when you look into the actual qualitative data and you see the same reason on both sides. So people saying slower communication or better communication in remote and not remote. So it's still about where this drives us and where this takes us. So if you think about tech companies, we have this unfair advantage in this space, and the thing I've been thinking about quite a lot is open source, right? So open source and tech communities are often just driven by a code of conduct and a manifesto. And people are able to collaborate asynchronously without any structure and get things created, valuable things for the planet. So we know it can be done, and we have an unfair advantage in doing it, which for me is super exciting.
Very cool. I think you've already spoken to some of the impacts that has on tech companies, but I don't know if you wanted to add something to, like, you know, seeing the companies that you're seeing getting that right, where there is still 17.5% of people who don't fancy remote work or don't see it as more productive. Like, what are some of the things that tech companies are doing right? I know you've already spoken to that, but if there's anything you wanted to add on this particular insight.
Yeah, look, I think the way that this is going, the people that are getting it right, in my mind, are the people that are working super hard on it. This requires an insane amount of effort. So the people that have understood that this does not require an alteration of the way we used to do things, it's a rethink, because we have to rethink the way that we collaborate. So it's companies that have like dedicated their CEOs time to figuring this thing out because they realize that needs to happen. So I think the companies that are winning the most are the ones that are taking it insanely seriously. And the other thing I think about this is remote. The world that we now live in requires serious discipline. It requires discipline to have an informal conversation. It seems kind of oxymoronic, but for me to have a coffee chat with someone, I need to set time aside. I need to go in. I need to actually shift my mindset. I need to do all these things just to reap the benefits of what I used to get by walking down a corridor. So instilling that discipline, instilling that hard work into teams, that is a very orchestrated effort and a very intentional effort. So if you're not thinking about that as a company, you're going to need to, because the other companies are, as Rachel says. And once they've done it, you just the options are there, right? It's like once your newsfeed is personalized and you go to an unpersonalized newsfeed, like, what is all this crap? I don't know about all of this stuff. Once companies start respecting individuals' choice and giving them exactly what they want, it's going to be very difficult for you to kind of compromise when you don't have to at a pretty analogous company.
And I think just to if I'm trying to paraphrase in like a more concrete way, that like the difference there is, trying to take your process from 6 months ago and making it work versus looking at what's happening right now, and seeing what that means for like going forward. And I think there's a key difference because, the former is going to just be tense and stressful because you're trying to essentially fit a square peg into a round hole. Whereas, actually looking at, okay, what's happening in my team right now? How can I enable what's currently happening, or support what's currently happening? I think that, although it seems very obvious, it's a very nuanced shift in how people approach remote, for lack. And I know we remote is a word that needs to be defined by every company for themselves. Yeah. We've established that.
Yeah. So from our report, I mean, the one insight that I found useful in this kind of in this domain was about the interactions with direct managers, and 40% of that was an increase of it was more positive, saying managers are more available, and the big parts of that was productive meetings and tooling. But that again is just some kind of an amplification of an already existing relationship in my mind. The manager was already intentional, excited to kind of add value, communicate, and do all that kind of stuff, and the tooling's taken them there. And in the negative side, you could see the people that were lazy. If you're lazy as a manager, now it's even worse because you have to put in even more effort, and it's interesting to see that. So the whole thing is just this acceleration of trends and kind of the polarization of all of these kind of issues.
Yeah, I would just add to that like the companies that you would think are going to do well are doing well. And the companies that you would think are not going to do well are the ones who are struggling, exactly as you said, Stephen. I don't think there's a huge amount of surprise there. The other thing I wanted to add to what you were saying around this kind of concept of, having an active manager who firstly has accepted the fact that things are different now. And so they might still have that intention, but their methods of delivery need to change. Their mediums need to change. I think what it comes down to at the core is, our managers trusting of employees. And I think that's something which, if we go like really base level, it's a lot about trust. And so I think the companies which were already ahead, where they really, trusted their developers, listened to them, gave them freedom and flexibility, on certain areas, right, to kind of figure things out and make it work. Those companies are doing really well. But the ones who perhaps have never really had that trust or are uncomfortable with extending that out much further, those are the ones I think that are still, need to double down on that. And it's a hard thing to do. It's a culture shift.
I was going to say, I think, it's easy to say you need trust. It's hard to actually make that a reality and make that come to fruition.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I manage about 6 people of sort of direct reports who have kind of teams of their own. And yeah, I mean, I think a year ago, I would say I definitely trust them. Of course, if they're sick, they're sick. If they're going to get it done, they're going to get it done. If they disagree for good reasons, But it has been really different, moving to not being able to, walk up to their desk and see what's going on and not being able to see who they're meeting with or, whether they're smiling after the meeting or not. That's a real challenge, I think, for managers.
Maybe if not from people you've interacted with, but even just from a personal capacity, what is like a good first step to build trust, like in your own teams or in the companies you've worked with? Maybe Rachel, you can just take it first. I'll move on to Stephen now.
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing I always come to it is from a place of vulnerability. So you can't come in thinking that you know how this is going to play out, no matter how many people you've managed across your life or how much experience or not experience that you have. You have to come from a space of vulnerability. And so I try to be as transparent with my team as possible. Like as Stephen said earlier, this is an experiment, or I'm not sure how this is going to go, or we're going to give this a try for a month and then we're going to have a conversation about it. and just being really kind of open about that kind of thing. I struggle to see, and there are teams which can be successful with a kind of, dominant sort of army style leadership, but definitely not in engineering teams in my experience. And I think it's also something pretty hard to pull off. So I would say if you're a manager right now, and you're kind of struggling on how to take things forward, I would start off by just being really honest with your team that things aren't working, and your intention is to improve it. Let's figure out together how we go forward from there. And look, you build trust when you say that kind of stuff to your team members, and they come back with something fairly similar. I see that you're struggling, or you made a terrible decision last week, or your new system is a disaster. That's when there's trust being formed. If they come back and they say, sure, great, sounds good, then there's still something you need to work on there.
Cool. Stephen, do you want to add to that?
So the kind of terrible answer is start 12 months ago and hire amazing people. But I think it's kind of a joke, but it's also kind of not. If you're hiring now, or if you were hiring in the past 12 months, it's really paid off to focus on the kinds of people that you're putting in your team. And I think I'm privileged that the people around me I trust with everything. We've built that, and we've had to work on it, but I'm fundamentally think just having that team is an amazing starting place. The things we try and do towards building that trust, again, it's explicit communications. You have to be very explicit and take a lot of time and effort into explaining how you are thinking, because you don't have that kind of wishy-washy beginning of meeting talk where you're like, I bumped into Milan earlier today and he said this. You have to write that out in a Slack message and try and put it out that it's not look, he said we have to do this, and it becomes quite a lot of effort. So just trying to put real time into making sure you're communicating clearly, to making sure that you're making that informal time. So that donut Slack app, those kinds of things, really getting on board. You see a random 30-minute chat in your calendar, you're like, my week is already a mess. But taking that and understanding what the purpose of that is. And then the last thing I think that I try, at least with the team, and you'll know this, Jamira, is we share a Google Photos album, and just try and get some pictures of people's lives into kind of the foray, because you don't have that conversation. What did you do last weekend, or I can see Jamira's hair, but I don't know if he's bought new shoes. So I can't have that kind of conversation. So talking about the things that, because life has become work and work has become life now. It's all mixed, and I think just this interaction, I can't even see where Jamira is because he's got a Zoom background. A lot of my colleagues, I've only ever known their head and shoulders. I don't even know what's behind them, because from day one they've had Zoom backgrounds. So getting to know people a little bit so we can understand lenses and build trust, that's hard now. But I'm trying to do all of those kinds of things. And luckily the people that I have are kind of on board and play along, and we're trying to do it together. So I think, just as you say, saying, look guys, I'm trying to do this thing. It may be super awkward, it may not work, but let's try and do it together. I think that's the plan. So I agree with Rachel there. Cool.
So in the sake of, here's my room, Stephen, so you can see. I've got my washing over here.
Nice.
I'm angled slightly differently, but normally the fridge is on that side. But I think I'd love to use the segue into this idea of how it's going to affect hiring for companies, because I think the conversation I've been having recently are all touching on this, that define remote work really well, know what you mean when you say we're remote friendly, know what you mean for the next 6 months for remote. And I think, Rachel, you touched on this already, but also this idea of just matching job specs to resumes when it's location independent. It's not enough anymore. You really have to understand the person. And I think that's very tricky. But just out of interest, what do you think, what do you see some of these insights in terms of their impact on how companies are hiring developers? I don't know if either of you want to jump into that first.
Yeah, so I think one thing that we've always believed, but is even more true now, is that remote work starts with remote first hiring. And that's a really easy sentence to say. But, we can unpack it a little bit, and it means a lot more than just, using Zoom for interviews or whatever, right? So if you're applying for a job today, the positive thing is that you get to experience how that company communicates and works remotely during the hiring process. In a sense, it's almost like a mini kind of taste of what that future might be like. And so one of the things that we've been working with a lot of our customers who are hiring a whole heap of engineers around the world, as you said now, is really making sure that the way that they approach remote hiring has been designed to really show off what they're good at when it comes to remote work. And that being a key part of it. So not replacing, okay, we used to do a whiteboard session, now we're going to do a whiteboard session but online. Have you ever tried to draw something on one of those virtual whiteboards? It's pretty difficult, right? So you need to have different versions of that make sense for remote, and potentially really change kind of your process there. I think the other thing that obviously changes when it comes to hiring is broadening things out. So you could have asked recruiters, 5 years ago, are they open to remote work? And most of them would have said, for the right person, maybe, but generally speaking, no. Today, if you were to ask them that question, they would say absolutely. Firstly, there's no option today, but secondly, as we know, there are so many great developers in all corners of the world, and if you are limiting your search to a specific geographical area, you're definitely missing out. And so that's in summary, I think when we think about companies who are hiring today, what really changes for them is really thinking about how their remote work reflects on their remote first hiring process, and the steps and the transparency that they provide to the candidate through that experience. And then also, where they're going to attract great talent, because that so many developers today will want to be able to understand and kind of I lost my answer. What I wanted to say though is that these companies have that opportunity to hire people from places they weren't hiring from before, and that's just a no-brainer for a lot of developers. If you want to work remotely, why bother applying for a company down the road? If you really are invested into that, you have the choice to go further abroad.
So could you just tell me a little bit, because you were talking about this designing your hiring process for remote, what does that mean?
Well, so firstly, sitting in a room with the rest of the hiring team and having a talk about how that process is going to go. I think a lot of companies, particularly at the start of COVID, had to sort of very quickly kind of slapdash put things together of oh crap, we were having, 80 people were meant to come on site next week. Obviously now they can't come. What are we going to do? And so now we've had a lot more time to figure out what works and what doesn't. And really that's the thing that they should be doing, is sitting in a room together, mapping out literally what are the steps, how much time should there be within each of those steps, and then what are the platforms and the systems that we're going to use to make sure it's secure, works smoothly, that we've got all the information we need, but also quite honestly that the candidate does as well. Because I think this, you were joking before, kind of taking off your Zoom background and we could see your laundry, which by the way doesn't look bad at all. I should show you what I've got going on. But that kind of transparency and allowing the candidate to get to know the company more is something that's really important. And so it's a good opportunity to do that. So whether it is rather than having a bunch of 1 hour interviews with kind of the leadership, maybe you want them to do kind of 15-minute quick runs with different people one-on-one. We all know that being in a Zoom call with 10 people or 6 people or even 5 people isn't very good. People speak all over the top of each other all the time, so maybe one-to-one is going to be a better experience. And then also, how are you communicating with that developer through the process? How are you telling them what's coming next? Because when you're walking out of the interview room in the olden days, you can find out a lot of that information. You can see that there's dogs. You can see what coffee machine they have. You can see how many desks there are. You can see how close the desks are together, and that might give you an idea about how they kind of structure and how they think about spacing and kind of focus. So all of that kind of stuff, I think, is stuff that needs to be translated to the virtual world.
So just to paraphrase and maybe also pose a question here. So it sounds like, and this is also touching on a report by Recruity, which I'm actually talking talking through in the next few weeks. But one of those insights were that most companies still don't have remote hiring policies, that they're, as you said, they're still slapdashing things together. So if I were to say, irrespective of whether you hold on to remote work or the extent to which remote work exists, every company should have a remote hiring policy in place. Do you agree with that, and why?
Yeah, I agree with that. A couple of reasons why I agree. First off, it's a lot more efficient. So from a time perspective and from a financial perspective. So if you're a candidate today, you're applying for a couple of different jobs at the same time. Having to go on site every time and travel to whichever, wherever location they are around the world, that's a massive commitment on your side. And so being able to more quickly get to a decision point that's, lighter effort on your side is absolutely a positive thing. And then, same thing for the company. So many hours and so much money has gone into running a, more kind of analog hiring process that now doesn't really need to be there. And I think a lot of companies are really starting to realize that. So I would definitely agree that obviously you need to go with the remote first hiring process, and it's a great way as well to be transparent with your candidates about what remote means for you as an organization and whether or not they've got the right attitudes and preferences. As you said, let's not forget about the 9%. There's plenty of people who don't necessarily want to work in a remote world. Great. During your remote first hiring process, you'll tease that out and you'll see whether the balance is there for you or not.
And then Stephen, I mean, obviously, like we, as a company, we work a lot with tech companies who are hiring as well. All of which have had to do to some extent move their processes online. So in terms of hiring, like what are your thoughts on the impacts that these insights from these reports have on how tech companies approach hiring developers? And maybe we can also talk a bit about the fact that this is quite developer driven. Developers want remote work. How does that impact how tech companies, I guess, even attract developers into their teams?
Yeah, cool. I think maybe we can start with that last comment. It's quite interesting when because in the Codility report, looked a little bit at why some developers were kind of more motivated in this aspect. In our report, I found some very interesting that developers rated one of the main reasons that they were more motivated in that they need to prove that remote can work. So it is very developer-led, right? The candidates and people who work want this. Companies and directors and managers generally don't because of the aforementioned laziness, because it takes an insane amount of work to get managing people remotely and asynchronously, whether those two are the same. We can have another discussion about that. But organizing people without having a place to just walk them in together and let them kind of organize themselves is way more difficult. So it is developer-led, I think, which kind of takes me to the next point of it's just open now. It's just you can hire anyone anywhere if it's completely remote, which means you're competing against everybody all of a sudden. So we've had this kind of employer branding has been a thing. You got to let people know who you are. So I think it's that kind of it's everywhere now statement coupled with the you've got to build trust thing. Now, how do you build trust with somebody in a very short space of time, over a very short amount of interactions? They got to trust you with their career. You've got to trust them with a massive commitment that could tank your company. Hiring someone is it's like dating, right? So dating moved from real world to Tinder. And that's happened now. So we have to learn how to build our Tinder profiles and learn the tricks of the trade and those kinds of things because you're competing. You're competing in a massive market, and you really need to think that through. So there's this candidate experience that happens. If you don't get back to a candidate, there's 5 other people that are getting back to them, and they've run them through, and they've made a cool video about how they do things, and they actually invited them to their Zoom pub quiz and a bunch of stuff like that. And they started to build trust and just be a bit vulnerable and say, look, this is where we are. Maybe I gave them a cribs tour of the boss's house and showed them what's on the boss's fridge and those kinds of things. You've got to compete against that. So you have to really innovate and start to think quite clearly about how you explicitly tell someone who you are. So how do you become vulnerable? And you can't just rely on your charm. And a lot of managers, and myself included, cool, I'll just wing the interview, I'll them explain it, and they'll get the vibe, and they'll love it. You can't do that anymore, you can't just drop them in the lunch hall with everyone and rely on the old things. So I think it's about realizing you're competing and making a concerted effort there.
I think if I'm understanding this idea of going global, and now your competition is not just from your city, it's from every other country in the world, it sort of raises the par. Like it's not just enough to have a website, or it's not just enough to have like an intro video. You actually need to, really think about what is it that we are as a company. And when you reach out to someone, what is the one thing that they really want that your company is also motivated by, and how do you make that thing align? And I think this was the earlier point that I raised as well. It seems like recruiters are thinking a lot less about just doing a one-to-one match between job specs and resume, and actually spending time thinking about what is this person driven by, like what is going to fulfill them, and how is this company going to do that for them? Because at the end of the day, if you're up against like a Twitter who has a bigger salary, that's the thing that's going to sway someone. And if they're not swayed, then there's no point in pursuing them. If they want a higher salary, then that's what they want, but then that's their motivator.
I think the one you mentioned, remote policy earlier, and I like the way Rachel put it. I think you've got to explain to someone, look, this is our stance on remote. And if you don't have a stance by now, get one quickly.
Yeah.
And then put it together and say, this is our stance, and be decisive and say, look, this is how we see the world right now. And this is what we're testing. And you're going to be a part of that test, because all of us are testing something right now. So explain to the candidate, look, this is where we are. But you can't do that unless you've sat down and said, this is what our stance is as a management team or as a company. So sit down. It will change for sure. Accept that, but be explicit. And that's the first step, I think, in starting that relationship with the candidate, going, look, we don't know where we are, but this is how we're currently thinking, and you're going to be a part of this journey. And that's starting to create that vulnerability and that open communication, I think.
I mean, geez, we've unpacked so many fun things in this conversation. Just sort of like close it up, was there anything either of you wanted to drop in or mention that we haven't spoken about yet?
One thing I think I should mention, given that, Codility kind of sits and works with the type of companies that we do. While this year has been really dramatic from a workplace perspective and the shift to remote and everything that's wrapped up with that, I think this year has also been a strong reminder for all of us around the lack of diversity, the bias that still exists, not just in engineering teams, but to be frank, all around the world at every level.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I think is really important for us to remember, or potentially to be excited by, is that these issues, these pieces are not necessarily connected, but there's value to get when you put them together. So being open to being remote, hiring people in a remote fashion, hiring people who are not in the same time zone, location. Means that you're looking to people you weren't hiring previously. And I think for a lot of the companies that I've been working with recently, they see this shift to remote, and they're figuring out, how can we leverage this to help us build more diverse developer communities, more diverse engineering teams in the future? How can we make sure that this doesn't go the opposite direction? And I think for a lot of us kind of looking from the outside, what we're seeing makes us feel very, very optimistic, because there are more opportunities now for those who previously might have been locked out for whatever reason. And also companies are really seeing that they do need to take this issue seriously. They need to be clever about how they approach inclusion and really put effort and time into that as well. And that all of those hours they spend on figuring out how to be remote, how to work asynchronously, how to hire remotely, all of those hours pay off when it comes to building a more diverse team. And honestly, for all of us, that's got to be a good thing.
That's a great way to kind of to finish it up. I think the other partner, the soft voices, that thing is, it's so easy now. It's even easier to be exclusive. So So it's all very well getting the most diverse team you can have. But we really have to really try to include people and give people voices, and to really let people help shape our products, right? Because it's easy to walk over people now. It's even easier because you don't have to do it in person. So I think the other part of that is when we're planning these things, if you're planning a remote meeting or whatever the story is, just make sure that you've heard everyone had a chance to turn on their camera, be visible, have their say, and actually contribute to what you're building. I think it's a difficult thing to do. It's the other partner, but I think it's just as important as we unpack this thing, because otherwise, what's the point, right?
Cool. I mean, yeah, we all have a lot to learn, it feels. And I think, this conversation's definitely highlighted some of that, the role that the office is going to play, how we personalize things, how we really speak to individuals in our teams, and how we, rethink collaboration, and really take it with a new lens, and not try to use old sunglasses for a new sunset or a new sunrise, shall we say. But cool, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your reports. As I said, I will link them in the show notes, so if anyone wants to dig deeper, they're more than welcome to. Honestly, we could probably do another 5 of these and only skim the surface, but I really appreciate both of you spending the time with me this morning and having a little bit of a discussion.
Great, thank you. This is fun.